Hey guys, this video is going to be a general overview of the endocrine system. We're going to go through each of the endocrine glands and all the hormones they produce. So the endocrine system, just in general, is the collection of glands that produce hormones. Different hormones target different organs and tissues associated with different bodily systems. Hormones collectively promote metabolism, growth, tissue function, sexual reproduction, sleep, mood, and other physiological processes that promote homeostasis. It all begins, of course, with the hypothalamus, which is the master endocrine or homeostatic organ. The hypothalamus produces releasing and inhibiting hormones that are going to ultimately act on the anterior pituitary. These hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus are primarily peptide hormones or protein hormones. So starting with the hypothalamic anterior pituitary axis, those peptide hormones that are released from the hypothalamus travel to the anterior pituitary via what's called a hypophyseal portal system. And a portal system is just two capillary beds that are connected by veins, and the function of a portal system is just to maintain a concentration gradient. So the hormones travel from the hypothalamus to the portal system, and then they enter and bathe the cells in the anterior pituitary. Within the anterior pituitary are basically just these tropic cells, and when they are bathed by the hypothalamic hormones, this results in the stimulation and release of anterior pituitary hormones, also called tropic hormones. So there are numerous tropic hormones that are associated with various hypothalamic hormones. You guys do have to be familiar with some of them, so we'll just walk through them. So on the very first column, those are your hypothalamic hormones. In the middle are your tropic or anterior pituitary hormones, and then the very last column is just the tissues that they target. So from the hypothalamus is the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. It stimulates the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary, and these hormones, FSH and LH, then act on the testes and the ovaries. Next, corticotropin-releasing hormone, a hypothalamic hormone, that results in the release of adrenocorticotropin-releasing hormone from the anterior pituitary. ACTH then acts on the adrenal gland. Continuing down, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, is released from the hypothalamus. It then stimulates the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, from the anterior pituitary, and then TSH acts on the thyroid and the thymus gland. Next, we have growth hormone releasing or inhibiting hormone being released from the hypothalamus. It acts on the cells of the anterior pituitary to result in the release of somatostatin and growth hormone. Somatostatin and growth hormone then act on the gastrointestinal system. From the hypothalamus, you also have the release of prolactin releasing or inhibiting hormone. This results in the stimulation and excretion of prolactin from the anterior pituitary, and you guys probably know that prolactin acts on the mammary glands to stimulate the production of milk. There's also melanocyte releasing or inhibiting hormone being released from the hypothalamus. It acts on the anterior pituitary to stimulate the release of melanin stimulating hormone or inhibiting hormone, and then that acts on melanocytes. Now the hypothalamic posterior pituitary axis is very different. The posterior pituitary, for instance, is innervated directly by hypothalamic neurons. There is no portal system. And from these neurons, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone get directly released into the bloodstream. Oxytocin, of course, targets the mammary glands and uterine muscles, so it promotes pair bonding, uterine contractions, as well as breastfeeding. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, acts on the kidneys to help maintain blood pressure and volume by managing the amount of water that's in the body. So if there's a higher water concentration, that actually increases blood pressure. Now there's also the pineal gland. The pineal gland is very important in mediating circadian rhythm and seasonal metabolic changes. The way that it does this is by producing a neurotransmitter called melatonin. Melatonin is sometimes called your sleep hormone. It's synthesized directly from serotonin in response to changes in light level. So when there is no light, that is when the pineal gland begins synthesizing and secreting melatonin. Now the thymus gland, as you guys are probably well familiar with now, is the primary lymphatic organ. It secretes a hormone called thymosin that stimulates the development of T cells. And T cells are, of course, very associated with your immune system. I do want to point out that thymosin is actually stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary. So moving on to the thyroid gland mediates metabolism and protein synthesis. It produces three types of hormone. It produces triiodothyronine, which is T3, and thyroxine. Triiodothyronine is actually just the active form of thyroxine, or T4. And then it also produces calcitonin. So T3, as the active form of T4, helps to increase basal metabolic rate, and so that also increases oxygen and energy consumption. Calcitonin, on the other hand, regulates calcium and phosphorus metabolism by lowering blood calcium and phosphate levels. The way it does this is by inhibiting the reabsorption of calcium and phosphate and stimulating urinary excretion. Next are your parathyroid glands. You have 4, located on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. The parathyroid glands, they act in contrast to calcitonin by producing a parathyroid hormone that actually acts to increase blood calcium and phosphate levels by promoting calcium reabsorption in the kidneys as well as your gastrointestinal tract. Next is the pancreas, which has both an exocrine and endocrine function. The exocrine function of the pancreas is involved in the release of pancreatic enzymes that aid in digestion of proteins and fats in your small intestine. The endocrine function regulates blood sugar levels, and it's these endocrine hormones that are produced in what are known as the islets of Langerhans cells. So 3 of the hormones that the pancreas produces would be glucagon. Glucagon is a catabolic hormone that promotes the breakdown and release of glucose from the liver. Glucagon is secreted from the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans. Insulin, in contrast, is an anabolic hormone that promotes the storage of glucose as glycogen in the liver, and insulin is secreted from beta cells. Now, in association with insulin, the pancreas also releases amylin, which inhibits glucagon secretion. Amylin also delays gastric emptying into your small intestine. Amylin is, of course, secreted by beta cells in the islets of Langerhans. Next is the adrenal glands. These are also known as your suprarenal glands because they are on top of your kidneys. Like your kidneys, the adrenal glands have an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortical zones of the adrenal gland are the zona reticularis, the zona fasciculata, and the zona glomerulosa, and you have different hormones that are being produced by the different zones. So hormones produced in the cortex, starting with your zona glomerulosa, is aldosterone, and aldosterone regulates mineral balance, such as the retention of sodium ions and water by the kidneys. This, of course, in turn increases blood volume and pressure. The zona fasciculata produces glucocorticoids, which are your stress hormones, such as cortisol. And stress hormones basically regulate glucose metabolism, and they also can be involved in immunosuppression. Within the zona fasciculata is also the production of androgens. These are both dihydrotestosterone and testosterone that stimulate masculinization and male secondary sexual traits. Within the medulla of the adrenal gland, you will find the production of catecholamines, which are involved in your fight or flight response. This is your adrenaline or epinephrine and noradrenaline or norepinephrine, and then of course also dopamine is produced in the medulla of the adrenal gland. Moving on to your ovaries, this is the female gonad. It is where oogenesis or egg production occurs. The primary hormones of the ovary are estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is, of course, involved in oogenesis, ovulation, menstruation, and parturition being labor or giving birth. Progesterone is involved in several things, one of which is maternal aggression during pregnancy. It also inhibits the body from further ovulation if fertilization happens to take place. Another hormone that you want to make note of is human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. This is what the pregnancy tests detect. It's produced by the placenta after implantation, and it's very important because it promotes the further production of progesterone. So the way it works, and you guys should know this, you look at this figure here on the right, you'll notice before ovulation an increase in estradiol. That estradiol, as it's increasing, is becoming so concentrated within the follicle that it causes the follicle to erupt from the ovary. It is that eruption of the follicle that's called ovulation. Now, that leaves behind what's called a corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum, you'll see that increase in progesterone during this luteal phase, and you'll still see a relatively high level of estradiol maintained during the luteal phase too. If fertilization takes place, the levels of progesterone and estrogen are maintained because HCG is promoting their production, and progesterone is telling your body, do not ovulate again. If fertilization does not take place, HCG is never produced, and thus progesterone and estradiol secretion decreases, and that corpus luteum becomes what's called the corpus albicans, and that is when menstruation takes place. So now we're moving into the testes, which is the male gonad. This is where the production of sperm or spermatogenesis takes place. The primary hormone produced here, of course, is testosterone, and it's being produced by what are called Leydig cells. Testosterone is very important with regards to libido, muscle mass, spermatogenesis, as well as the development of secondary sexual characteristics such as body hair. But also produced here is a very important hormone called anti-Müllerian hormone that is basically telling your body that you're a male. So the way this works, and you guys should understand this, is that when you are developing in utero, you have both a Müllerian duct and a Wolffian duct. Okay? The Müllerian duct in females ultimately goes on to become the fallopian tube. The Wolffian duct in males ultimately goes on to become what's called the vas deferens. Now, females are considered the default sex, and here's why. On the Y chromosome, which only males have, is what's called the SRY gene. And if that SRY gene is present, the body produces anti-Müllerian hormone. The anti-Müllerian hormone is going to result in the regression or underdevelopment of the Müllerian duct, and thus the Wolffian duct is going to continue developing to become the vas deferens. Females are the default sex because without the presence of the SRY gene, anti-Müllerian hormone is not produced, and by default, the Müllerian duct begins developing into the fallopian tube, and the Wolffian duct regresses. So that is why the anti-Müllerian hormone is incredibly important with regards to males, and that is, of course, produced in the Sertoli cells. Last but not least, you guys should understand feedback loops. And this is just when hormones that are secreted by the endocrine gland feed back on the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary to inhibit or stimulate further hormonal secretion. This is in essence how the body maintains homeostasis. And you want this mechanism in place to ameliorate consequences such as allostatic load. And allostatic load is just the physiological consequence of chronic neuroendocrine responses such as stress. So chronic stress is just this chronic production of cortisol, right? And the chronic production of cortisol, if you guys remember from several slides ago, glucocorticoids are associated with glucose metabolism. And so it's resulting in the release of glucose and the use of glucose from peripheral organs or body tissues. And so once all that's used up, because you've been chronically producing cortisol, it can actually result in things like ketoacidosis, which is fatal. So allostatic load is something that you want to ameliorate, and that is why you have these feedback loops in place.